Wyoming Territory. July 1884. The train hissed and groaned behind her as it idled at the station in Casper, its black iron body cutting through the morning heat like a scar. Juliana Greer stood on the dusty platform, her gloved hands gripping the handle of her valise so tightly her knuckles turned white. She kept her chin high, even as the whispers followed her. Even as the hotel owner had ordered her out of town and back on the eastbound train with nothing but a cold look and a muttered, "This ain't the place for your kind, miss." She had not cried, not when the woman from the ladies' hospitality board refused her room. Not when the preacher's wife turned her face away in church. Not even when the schoolhouse shut its doors before she had the chance to teach a single child. But now, standing on the edge of everything she had hoped for, the sting behind her eyes threatened to break loose. "You do not belong here," they had said, because she was the daughter of an Irish washerwoman, because her skirts were too plain, because she had no husband. No family name worth holding, but she had not come to Wyoming to be liked. She had come to start over. The conductor called 10 minutes, and the platform stirred. A child cried. A man cursed as he dropped a crate of apples, but Juliana stood still, her gray traveling dress streaked with trail dust, her throat tight. Then came the sound of hooves, fast, determined. The kind of sound that made people look up with their hands already shielding their eyes from the sun. She turned, just as the horse galloped into view from the main street, its rider tall in the saddle, dark hat low over his brow. The horse slowed only slightly as he reached the edge of the platform, the beast's flanks dark with sweat. "Juliana," he called. She froze. It could not be, not him, not after all this time, but there he was, Pace Zanetti. He swung down from the horse in one fluid motion, boots landing hard on the boards, eyes locked on hers like he had not missed a moment in the 5 years since she had last seen him. "You are not going to say goodbye?" he asked, voice rough. "I was sent back," she said, trying to hold her ground to keep her voice steady. "There was no one to say goodbye to." He took a step closer. "You were not supposed to come here alone. No one asked your permission." His jaw flexed. "You were supposed to write me. You were supposed to marry me," she breathed. Their silence was louder than the train whistle that blew just then, long and low. People were boarding. Her time was almost up. She turned from him, lifting her valise. "Juliana." She stopped. "You are already mine." Her breath caught. He reached for her hand, not fast, not brash, just enough that his fingers brushed hers. "You always were," he said, quieter now, like it hurt to speak it. "You think I would let them send you away like you are nothing? You left," she whispered. "I had nothing to offer," he said. "Not then. But I have land now, cattle, a home. I have a place for you." She looked at him, this man who had once been a wild ranch hand with no future, just a stubborn heart and calloused hands. But he was not that boy anymore. "You rode all the way out here just to say that?" "No," he said. "I rode out here to take you home." The train hissed again. The conductor shouted, 2 minutes. Juliana looked back at the train, then at the man who had once broken her heart, standing now like he would never let it happen again. And she saw it plain as the morning sun that he meant it, that he had come for her, that when the world turned its back, he had not. She dropped the valise. He caught her as she stepped into his arms, her face burying into the rough linen of his shirt. His hand slid to the back of her head, holding her like she might vanish. "I will not leave again," she said. "You are not leaving at all," he murmured. She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes shining now. "Then take me home, Pace." His smile came slow, deep, sure. "I already am." Behind them, the train pulled away, but neither of them watched it go. The sun had climbed higher by the time they left the edge of Casper behind, riding double on the back of Pace's dun mare. Juliana sat sideways, her skirts bundled close to keep them from catching on the stirrups, one hand resting lightly at his waist. Her gloves were still tucked in the pocket of her coat, forgotten. Neither of them spoke much as the town dwindled behind them. The air smelled of sage and dust, and the road east stretched empty and wide. A few hawks circled above the ridge, their shadows gliding over the ochre earth, and in the distance, the Laramie Range crouched low and blue against the horizon. After some time, she shifted. "How far?" "Half a day, give or take. My land sits past Bear Creek. We'll water the horse at the spring near the cottonwoods." Juliana nodded, her gaze following the hills as they rolled past. "You said you had a home." "I built it myself. Took 2 summers. Timber frame, sod roof. Not much to look at, but it holds heat in winter and keeps dry." Her fingers brushed the back of his shirt, then dropped away. "You always did better with your hands than with words." He glanced over his shoulder. "You always said that like it was a fault." "I meant it as a comfort." They passed a wagon track veering south, the wood-spoked ruts baked hard into the ground. A jackrabbit darted from the brush, and Pace's mare gave a small start, but he steadied her with a low murmur and a hand to her neck. Juliana's voice came softer now. "You said you had cattle." "Started with 8 head I bought from a widow near Sweetwater, traded fence work for feed. Now I've got close to 60, mostly Herefords." She turned her face into the breeze. "And you run it alone?" "Some neighbors help come branding time. Lost 1 steer to a mountain lion last spring. Otherwise, I manage." There was a pause, and then, "I wasn't sure if you were still alive." He adjusted the reins, guiding the horse around a washout. "I wrote you twice. After the war ended, before I had anything to offer. I never got them." He was quiet for a long while, the only sound the rhythmic clop of hooves and the wind sifting through dry grass. "I left them with your uncle in Cheyenne," he said at last. "Figured he'd pass them along." Her throat worked. "He died that winter." Pace didn't answer. He only straightened in the saddle, his jaw tight. They rode in silence until the cottonwood grove came into view, pale green leaves shivering in the heat. A narrow stream curled through the roots, half hidden by reeds. He dismounted and offered her his hand. She took it, letting him help her down, careful not to meet his eyes. He led the mare to the water and let her drink, then turned to her. "You hungry?" She hesitated, then nodded. "A little." He untied a cloth-wrapped parcel from the saddle and unwrapped it on a flat rock. Corn cakes, dried meat, a piece of apple wrapped in wax paper. He handed it to her without comment, then took a seat under the tree and leaned his back against the trunk. She sat opposite, smoothing her skirt beneath her. "This isn't how I pictured seeing you again." "How'd you picture it?" "In a letter. Years from now. Saying you'd married some girl with a good dowry and a strong back." He tore off a piece of meat and chewed. "I don't want a dowry. I want you." She didn't answer right away. The cottonwoods whispered overhead, and a red-winged blackbird called somewhere upstream. "You were 19 when you left," she said finally. "I thought I'd outlive the ache, so did I." She looked at the piece of apple in her hand, then offered it to him. He shook his head. "Keep it." She took a bite, slow and thoughtful, then wiped her fingers on her skirt. "I was never going to get back on that train," she said quietly. "I just didn't want to stand there alone." "You're not alone now." She looked at him then, truly looked at the lines bracketing his mouth, the sunburn along his neck, the way his boots were worn at the heels from long days in the saddle. "You built a life," she said. "I built it for you." Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. Instead, she reached across the space between them and laid her hand over his. "I'd like to see it." "You will," he said. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, rough and warm. The wind shifted. Somewhere beyond the trees, a cow bellowed in the distance, deep and low. He stood and offered his hand again. She took it without hesitation this time. They rode on. They reached Pace's land just as the sun began to soften, its light turning the hills gold and the shadows long. The mare crested a low ridge, and below, nestled in a shallow basin near a line of cottonwoods, stood the house. It was modest. A single-story structure of hand-hewn logs, with a sloped sod roof and a stone chimney that leaned ever so slightly to one side. A split-rail fence ran a rough perimeter, and beyond it, a small paddock held 2 horses and a swayback mule nosing at a trough. Smoke drifted faintly from the chimney, though no fire could have been needed in the summer heat. The scent of it reached her pine and something faintly sweet. Juliana didn't speak right away. She took in the tilled patch of earth near the doorway, where corn stalks pushed up through the soil, and the bucket hanging from a hook beneath the eave. It wasn't grand, but there was care in every corner. "Who's minding the place while you ride off after women?" she asked, a small lift to her brow. "Jed from over the ridge. He watches the stock when I'm gone, doesn't touch the house." He glanced at her. Didn't want anyone else in it. She slid down from the saddle as he dismounted beside her. Her boots crunched softly on the dry grass. "You live alone," he nodded. "Just me and the mule, and sometimes the wind." They approached the house together, and he pushed open the door. The interior was dim and cool, the scent of dried herbs and old wood pressed deep into the walls. A table stood beneath the front window, its top worn smooth by use. A narrow bed was tucked in the far corner, the quilt neat but faded. A shelf above it held a row of books, only a few, but their bindings were familiar. Her eyes settled on one. A worn volume of poetry once kept on her mother's mantel. "You kept it," she said. "You read it to me once. I remembered the way your voice changed on the last lines." She touched the spine but didn't pull it down. "I never took you for a reader. I never told you everything." She turned to him then, her expression unreadable. "Why now, Pace?" He didn't move closer. "Because I built this with you in mind, every beam, every fence post. I told myself if I ever saw you again, it'd be with something to offer besides promises." Her voice dropped. "And if I hadn't come, I would have gone on building." He paused. "But I wouldn't have been living." She looked around the room again, slower this time. A tin basin sat near the hearth, half filled with water. A piece of blue calico cloth hung from a peg near the door. Everything was simple but tended. Real. "I brought nothing with me," she said. "You brought yourself." He stepped past her and set a kettle on the stove, then lit the fire beneath it. "There's a basin if you want to wash. I'll see to the mare before the light fades." She watched him go, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. For a long moment she stood still. Then she crossed to the small wooden chest beside the bed and opened it. Inside were folded shirts, a straight razor, a rosary tucked into the corner. Nothing extravagant. Just a life quietly lived. She poured a little water into the basin and washed her face with the cloth from the peg. The coolness steadied her. Outside, she heard the low murmur of his voice as he spoke to the horses, the creak of leather, the clink of a bit. By the time he returned, the kettle was beginning to steam. She had set out 2 tin cups and found the small tin of dried chamomile leaves near the hearth. "You remember how I take it?" he asked, removing his hat. "1 spoon. No sugar." He leaned against the wall, watching her with a stillness that felt older than both of them. "You've changed. So have you." He didn't argue. They sat at the table, the cups between them, steam rising in soft curls. Through the open window, the last of the sun touched the tops of the grass, and a coyote called from somewhere beyond the ridge. "Did you ever think we'd end up like this?" she asked. "No." He traced the rim of his cup with one finger. "But I hoped." She let that sit between them a moment, then said, "There's something you should know." He looked up. "They called me a disgrace. I know. They said I'd brought shame. You didn't. She met his gaze then, steady and unguarded. Do you believe that? I believe you're the strongest person I've ever known. And I believe they were afraid of anything they couldn't own or understand. Her eyes didn't waver. And you, I don't aim to own you, I aim to stand beside you. She reached across the table, her fingers wrapping around his. I'm not afraid of building something from nothing, she said. Good, he answered, voice low, because we've got everything we need right here. Night gathered at the windows, soft and deep, but neither of them moved to light the lantern. They sat with hands joined, the tea cooling between them, and the quiet settling into something that felt like a beginning. The next morning broke slow and gray, with a pale mist clinging to the low ground like breath not yet drawn. Juliana stood barefoot just inside the doorway, the cool clay floor grounding her as she watched the light stretch across the basin. The scent of damp earth rose through the open window, and somewhere close, a meadowlark sang once, then fell quiet. She had braided her hair before dawn, fingers working on instinct more than intent. Her dress, wrinkled from sleep, hung loose at the waist, and she hadn't yet laced her boots. Behind her, the fire in the stove crackled, and the kettle rattled gently. Pace stepped in from the yard, a length of rope coiled over one shoulder, the cuff of his sleeve damp near the wrist. Creek's risen some, he said, setting the rope on the hook by the door. Won't flood, but we'll have to ride the south edge when we take the cattle to graze. She didn't turn from the window. Do you always speak of the land first thing? His pause was brief. Usually I speak to the mule. You're a step up. That drew the ghost of a smile from her, small and tired. What's the south edge like? Rocky. But the grass holds longer into summer, shaded some by the ridge. She nodded, then turned toward the table. I can mend the tear in your sleeve. I noticed it when you came in. He looked down at the frayed fabric near his elbow. Didn't think you'd be looking that close. Hard not to, she said, already pulling needle and thread from the tin on the windowsill. He watched her move with quiet precision, threading the needle without hesitation, her fingers steady. You always took to fixing things. She kept her eyes on the fabric, because no one else would, and things fall apart whether you notice or not. He sat across from her, arms folded. I noticed. Her fingers paused over the stitch. Then why didn't you come back sooner? Because I didn't know if you'd still want me. She finished the seam before answering. You thought I'd forget. I thought you'd harden. She folded the sleeve neatly and laid it beside him. I did. He reached for the repaired shirt but didn't put it on. And now, I'm still mending, she said. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. Then I'll wait. They didn't speak for a while after that. The kettle began to whistle softly. She rose to pour the water, her movements slow and deliberate. You ever think of leaving Wyoming? She asked, handing him the cup. Once, he said, wrapping his hands around the tin. When the nights got too quiet, she sat again. And I stayed. I kept thinking of a voice I hadn't heard in years, telling me not to quit just because it got hard. She looked down into her tea. I used to talk to you, after you left, out loud sometimes. What did I say back? That you'd come back when you were ready. He took a careful sip. You were right. She traced the rim of her cup, not looking up. They made me leave the schoolhouse before I could even speak to the children. I'll build another if you want one. That's not what I meant. I know. He reached across the table, palm up. But I'll still build it. She placed her hand in his. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. Tell me about your mother, he said. That stopped her. Why? Because I never asked, and I should have. She hesitated, then began, voice low. She worked herself down to the bone. Scrubbed floors for people who wouldn't meet her eyes. She gave me everything she could, even when it wasn't much. She'd teach you to read. She taught me how to survive. He nodded once. That's harder. Juliana looked out the window again. The mist had lifted, revealing the slope of land beyond the cottonwoods, the tall grass shining faintly with dew. "You think you'll always be alone out here?" "Not anymore," she turned back to him. "Then don't make me promises, make me space." "You already have it. Every part of this place has your name on it." Her eyes didn't fill, but something caught in her chest, as if her ribs had been holding her breath for years. Outside, the cattle lowed from the far pasture, and the sun finally broke through the cloud cover, brittle but warm. She stood and crossed to the door. "I want to see the fence line." He rose without question, pulling his coat from the peg. "It's a long walk." "I'm not afraid of long." He opened the door for her, and she stepped out into the light, boots laced now, braid tied with a strip of worn muslin. As they walked side by side toward the ridge, the air smelled of wet wood and the promise of something growing. Neither of them looked back. The ridge took a good hour to reach by foot, the trail narrow and slanting, with patches of loose stone that shifted under their boots. Juliana moved steadily. Skirts tied off above her ankles with a strip of leather Pace had offered, her breath even despite the climb. The air changed as they rose drier, sharper, laced with the scent of juniper and the faint musk of mule deer that had passed through during the night. When they reached the top, the land opened wide before them. The northern boundary of Pace's property ran along a line of weathered posts, some leaning, others snapped at the base where winter winds had taken their toll. Beyond that, the earth dropped into a shallow ravine, where cottonwoods grew in dense clusters and a narrow creek glinted in the sun. Pace crouched beside one of the posts, pressing his thumb to the cracked wood. "I'll need to replace this whole stretch before autumn." Juliana knelt beside him, her hand brushing the brittle grass. "Do you cut the posts yourself?" He nodded, eyes scanning the timberline farther west. "Haul them down by mule." "Takes time. You'll need help." "I will." She looked at him then, her expression unreadable. "I can hold a saw." He didn't smile, but something in his shoulders eased. "I'd trust you with one before half the men I've hired." She stood, brushing her hands against her skirt. "If I'm going to stay, I want to be useful." "You are, just by being here." She turned her face into the wind, letting it thread through the loose strands of her hair. "I won't be anyone's kept woman." "I wouldn't want you if you were." He said it without hesitation, like it was the truest thing he knew. They walked the length of the ridge, checking each post in turn. Some could be salvaged, others not. Juliana asked about the grazing patterns, the snowfall last winter, the likelihood of wolves. He answered plainly, without embellishment, letting her understand the work for what it was: difficult, constant, and theirs to do if she chose it. When they reached the far end of the fence line, she sat on a flat stone and looked out across the land. A hawk circled above the ravine, its wings catching the light. The creek below wound through the cottonwoods like a silver thread, and on the far bank, a herd of elk moved slow and careful through the brush. "This place feels like it's waiting for something," she said. He sat beside her. "Maybe it was waiting for you." She didn't answer right away. Then, "I never imagined peace would be so quiet." He looked out at the horizon. "It's not always. Come October, the wind will shake the walls loose some nights, and winter's harder than most folks can stand." "I can stand it." He turned to her. "I know." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. "I was going to write to you," she said, "after I left Cheyenne." "I never did." "Why not?" "I didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound like begging." "You wouldn't have had to beg. But I wanted to find my footing first. I didn't want you to see me desperate. I would have come anyway." She unfolded the paper and handed it to him. "Read it." He took it, eyes scanning the lines. It was short, a few sentences. Nothing poetic. Just her name, the place she'd gone, and the words, "If you still think of me, I'd like to know." He handed it back. "I would have answered yes." She tucked it away. I think I knew that. They sat a while longer, letting the sun warm their backs and the silence settle. When they rose, he reached for her hand. She let him take it. By the time they returned to the house, the light had turned amber, casting long shadows across the yard. He led her to the shed behind the house, where a stack of timber waited, and a second door she hadn't noticed before stood slightly ajar. He pushed it open. Inside, the space was bare wood and sunlight, a window facing east and a small stone hearth built into the wall. "I started this last winter," he said. "It was going to be for tools, but if you want it," she stepped inside, running her fingers over the sill. "It could be a schoolroom," he nodded. "Or whatever else you need. I'd like to teach again. I'll help you get the permit." She turned to him, her face open now. "And if I want to marry you," he stepped across the threshold, closing the space between them. "Then I'd say yes, and I'd say it every day after." Her voice caught, but she didn't look away. "I want a life we build with our hands, nothing borrowed, nothing someone else gave us. You'll have it." She reached up, touching the side of his face. "Then I'm yours. If you'll have me." He drew her close, his arms wrapping around her like shelter, like promise. No rush, no doubt. Just the quiet certainty of something long awaited, finally here. They stood that way until the sky deepened, until the shadows stretched long and cool across the yard. Then they went inside and closed the door behind them. 3 weeks later, they married beneath the cottonwoods, with only the land and the wind to bear witness. Jed from over the ridge brought a jug of corn whiskey and his fiddle, and the preacher from Douglas rode out with his wife and said the vows plain and short. Juliana wore a dress made from cream calico she'd traded for in town, and Pace had shaved for the first time in a month. They said their promises with hands clasped tight, eyes steady, no trembling mouths or second-guessing. After dark, they sat on the porch while the fireflies rose, their fingers interlaced, boots touching. No music played, nothing more needed saying. The schoolhouse opened that autumn, with 12 children from neighboring ranches coming in on horseback and wagon. Juliana taught them letters and numbers and how to listen with their whole selves. She never raised her voice, but silence fell when she stood. Pace spent his days running fence and birthing calves, and showing the youngest boys how to trim hooves without losing a finger. He never missed supper. He never left without telling her when he'd be back. The winters came hard and cold, and the roof needed patching twice. But the fire never failed, and neither did they. They grew older together, not in great leaps, but in the slow, sure way of people who have earned each other. Their hands bore the marks of work, their backs the weight of years, but their eyes never forgot how to find one another across a room. And in all those days through dust and flood and the long hush between seasons, Juliana never again stood alone on a platform, waiting for someone who wouldn't come, because Pace had come, and he stayed.